My name is Holly Crawford, and I'm 26 years old. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday when the pain hit me like a freight train. I'd been feeling off all evening, a dull ache in my lower right side that I kept brushing off as gas, or maybe something I ate. But at 2 a.m., that dull ache turned into the kind of pain that makes you crawl across the floor. I couldn't stand. I couldn't breathe right. I was drenched in sweat, shaking, gripping the edge of my bathroom sink, staring at my own reflection like I was watching a stranger fall apart. I knew something was catastrophically wrong. I grabbed my phone and called my mom. No answer. I called again. Nothing. I called my dad, straight to voicemail. I kept calling back and forth between the two of them, my hands trembling so badly I could barely tap the screen. By call number 17, I was lying flat on my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the same greeting I'd heard my whole life. "You've reached David Crawford. Leave a message." I left 3, each more desperate than the last. On the final one, I was crying so hard, I don't know if the words even came out right. I said, "Dad, I think I'm dying. Please come." Nobody came. What happened next? I only know because the paramedics told me afterward. My neighbor, Mrs. Patton, a retired woman in her 60s who barely knew my name, heard me through the thin apartment wall. She heard me collapse. She called 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was barely conscious. The paramedics said my appendix had burst. Another 30 minutes on that kitchen floor, they told me, and the outcome would have been very different. They didn't say the word death outright, but I understood exactly what they meant. I was rushed into emergency surgery. On the operating table, my heart stopped. I flatlined. The surgical team brought me back, but for one brief moment, I was gone. No white light, no voices, just a deep, absolute silence. Then, just as suddenly, noise returned. Machines beeping, someone calling my name, an unbearable ache in my chest from the compressions. When I finally woke in the recovery room, groggy and confused, a nurse was sitting beside me. I asked if my parents had come. The look she gave me is one I'll never forget. Not quite pity, but close. She told me my emergency contacts had been called, and that someone had in fact shown up at the hospital. Before she could explain further, the surgeon walked in. He was calm, Dr. Reeves, with tired eyes and a steady voice. He pulled a chair to my bedside and sat down, which alone told me this wasn't going to be a routine update. "Holly," he said, "you had a very serious night. We almost lost you." I nodded. I already knew that part. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. "A woman claiming to be your mother came to this hospital tonight. She tried to have you discharged early." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. Discharged early? I had just flatlined on a table. He held my gaze. "She was told that wasn't possible, given your condition." She got argumentative with the staff. The room seemed to tilt slightly. He glanced toward the door and added, "But the man who paid your bill said—" Before he could finish, the door opened. Standing there was a man I'd never seen before in my life, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, in a plain gray jacket and dark trousers. His eyes were kind, the sort that carry weight without feeling heavy, if that makes sense. He wasn't flashy. He didn't look wealthy or important at first glance. He looked like somebody's quiet, dependable father. He stepped in slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure he had the right to be there. Dr. Reeves stood, nodded to him respectfully, and excused himself, leaving the two of us alone. I pulled my hospital blanket up a little, more from instinct than anything, and asked who he was. He sat in the chair Dr. Reeves had just left and folded his hands. He told me his name was Gerald Mays. He said he'd been in the hospital that night visiting his own brother on another floor when he overheard the commotion at the front desk. A woman, my mother, loudly demanding the staff release me because, and I'm quoting him directly, her other daughter's baby shower was in the morning and the whole family needed to be home. Gerald said the nurses had refused. They explained that I was in critical postoperative care and that discharging me could cost me my life. My mother's response, he said, was to ask whether there was paperwork she could sign to override the medical decision. He watched the whole thing from 20 feet away, a complete stranger, and said something shifted in him that he couldn't quite explain. He quietly asked a nurse what was happening with the patient in question. She couldn't share details, but he'd seen enough. No family member had come to sit with me. My mother left the building. He walked to the billing desk and asked about my situation. When he learned I had no one present and that a gap in my insurance would create an immediate hold on my continued care, he paid it. Just like that, a stranger covered my hospital bill so the staff could keep treating me without interruption. I didn't know what to say to him. I genuinely had no words. Minutes earlier, I'd learned my mother tried to pull me out of a hospital bed the night I flatlined so she could rest up for a baby shower. Now a man whose last name I hadn't known 5 minutes before was sitting beside me, telling me he'd quietly made sure I stayed alive. I started crying, not softly, but the raw, broken kind that comes from somewhere you normally keep locked away. Gerald didn't try to stop me or tell me everything was fine. He just sat there. It was exactly the right thing to do. My parents arrived later that day. My mother walked in first, and her opening line was that she hadn't heard her phone. It had been on silent. 17 calls, and she hadn't heard a single one. Then she looked around the room and asked why there was a flower arrangement on the windowsill. Gerald had left it before heading back upstairs to his brother. I told her a stranger had bought it. "That's odd," she said. She never asked who or why. My father stood by the door the whole visit, arms crossed, nodding along to whatever she said, never once sitting beside me. They stayed 40 minutes and left because, as my mother put it, there was still cleanup from the baby shower. She mentioned my sister had a beautiful morning and that I would have loved it. After they left, I lay in that hospital bed and made a decision. Quietly, clearly, almost surprising myself. I was done shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never built for me. Gerald visited twice more before I was discharged. On the last visit, he brought his wife, Patricia, a warm woman who held my hand and said, "You have people, sweetheart. You just haven't met all of them yet." I think about that sentence every single day. I later learned, through the nurses, that Gerald had formally reported my mother's discharge attempt to the hospital's patient advocacy office. He never mentioned it himself. He wasn't the kind of man who needed credit for doing the right thing. But the hospital had it on record, which meant that if anything had gone wrong that night because of outside interference, there would be a paper trail. I've fully recovered now. My relationship with my parents is still something I'm working through, but the fog has lifted on who they've always been versus who I needed them to be. Two very different things I confused for far too long. Gerald and Patricia have become real family to me, the kind defined by presence and action, not blood or obligation. If this story reached you today, I want you to know something. The people who show up for you in your darkest moments, even strangers, even quietly, even unasked, are the ones who show you what love actually looks like. And sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to see clearly whose hands were never really holding you in the first place.